You ever hear that faint scratching sound and just know you're not alone? That's how this whole squirrel fiasco began. It was late afternoon, and the sun was dropping behind the ridge, painting the treetops gold. I'd just finished pitching my tent and was leaning against a log, sipping from my canteen, when I heard the noise. At first, I thought it was the usual forest chatter. Chipmunks scurrying, branches creaking, maybe a bird hopping through the leaves. But no, this was different. The sound had rhythm, like something determined, pawing and tugging at fabric. I turned my head, and sure enough, my backpack, propped up against a pine, was shifting ever so slightly, like it had taken a breath. I squinted, trying to see in the fading light. The next thing I know, the flap flips open, and out pops the head of a squirrel, eyes wide and shiny as river stones. Not a nervous glance and go squirrel either. This one looked at me like I was the intruder. I chuckled, figuring it was just sniffing around for trail mix crumbs. I walked over, clapping my hands to scare it off, but instead of bolting, the little rascal dove deeper into the pack. I unzipped the side pocket, thinking I'd shoo it out, and wouldn't you know, it had wedged itself right between my rolled up socks and a bag of jerky. It squeaked, tail flicking in protest, like I'd just barged into its bedroom. That was the moment I realized this squirrel wasn't just passing through. It had decided my backpack was its new apartment, rent-free. I tugged gently at the straps, shook the bag, even tapped it against the ground. Nothing worked. Every time I thought it might dart out, I'd see a pair of paws gripping tighter inside, claws hooking into fabric like it had signed a lease. And so, while the fire crackled to life and the shadows lengthened, I found myself staring at my own gear, occupied by a squirrel that acted more like a roommate than a trespasser. I figured I'd win this standoff in a matter of minutes. After all, how hard could it be to convince a squirrel to vacate a backpack? But as the evening settled in and the crickets began their chorus, I realized this critter wasn't going anywhere. Every time I reached for the zipper, I'd hear a sharp little chatter from inside, like it was scolding me. At one point, it even poked its head out, gave me a quick look that said, "You again," and then disappeared back into the depths of my gear. Now, I'll admit, I've dealt with raccoons raiding coolers, chipmunks stealing crumbs, even a bear, once that decided my neighbor's tent was worth a visit. But never had I faced such bold determination from something so small. This wasn't theft, it was occupation. I tried bargaining. I tossed a few crumbs of jerky a few feet away, hoping it would scurry after them. Nothing. I even cracked open a peanut butter packet and set it near the fire, thinking the smell would tempt it out. But my new roommate was no fool. It stayed burrowed deep, probably licking the salt off my socks. The problem, of course, was that all my essentials were in there. My spare clothes, food for the next day, even the little first aid kit I always carried. I couldn't exactly just hand it over. So I did what any tired, half-amused camper would do. I set the bag down by the tent and let the squirrel be, figuring it would sneak out once the night noises spooked it. But as the stars came out and the fire burned low, I kept hearing faint rustles, not outside in the brush, but inside my own camp, where that little freeloader was making itself at home. At one point, I swear I heard the sound of it rearranging things, as though it were redecorating. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to my so-called roommate chew and shuffle, the tiny landlord of my gear. By midnight, I started to wonder if I'd have to sleep with the bag zipped up inside the tent, just to keep from losing everything to a 4-ounce squatter. That's when the real trouble began. The trouble started with a sound no camper, ever wants to hear. At midnight, ripping fabric, I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, and fumbled for my lantern. The light flickered to life, and there it was. My backpack tipped over, the side pocket gnawed open like a chewed-up apple. My new roommate had decided renovations were in order. I scrambled out of the tent, whispering curses under my breath so I wouldn't scare the critter off completely. I figured if it ran into the woods, I'd never see half my gear again. Sure enough, the squirrel popped its head out of the shredded pocket, cheeks puffed out as if it were smug about the destruction. In its mouth was my packet of trail mix, the one I'd been saving for breakfast. Now, I've never stared down a bear, but I'll tell you this. The look that squirrel gave me was every bit as defiant. Its eyes glinted in the lantern light, and its tail twitched like a banner of victory. And then, without a shred of fear, it hopped onto the log, by the fire, ripped open the packet, and started eating my breakfast like we were two roommates splitting groceries. I tried the gentle approach first, walking over slowly and talking in that calm voice you'd use with a stray dog. "All right, buddy, you've had your fun." Hand it over. But the squirrel wasn't budging. Instead, it stuffed its mouth full, sat back on its haunches, and flicked its tail like it was laughing at me. That's when I made my mistake. I lunged. Not a full-on tackle, mind you, but a quick reach to snatch the bag of trail mix. The squirrel was quicker. It darted up my arm like a furry lightning bolt, across my shoulder, and down my back before I could even react. I yelped, spinning around, swatting at the air like a madman, while the little beast landed back on the ground, prize still in its teeth. For a split second, it froze, me glaring at it, it glaring back, and then it bolted straight into my tent. My tent. I stood there, dumbfounded, listening to the frantic rustle of nylon and the patter of tiny claws inside. The squirrel had officially upgraded from backpack squatter to full-blown housemate. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to be a simple eviction. If you've never had to negotiate with a squirrel inside a two-person tent at night, let me paint the picture. The thing about tents is, every little sound is amplified. The scratching, the rustling, the squeaking. It was like trying to sleep inside a drum while someone played a solo on claws and teeth. I crawled toward the zipper, thinking I could flush it out with a quick shake. But when I pulled the flap open, the squirrel darted between my sleeping bag and pillow, like it had been living there for months. I tried everything. Gentle nudges with a stick, a bit of bread crumbled near the doorway, even propping the flap open, hoping the night air would lure it out. But the stubborn critter had no intention of leaving. At one point, it climbed to the very peak of the tent and clung upside down like a bat, staring down at me with those gleaming black eyes. The more I tried, the more it seemed to dig in, as though I was the guest in its home. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it rearranging, dragging little odds and ends across the floor. My spare socks. Gone. The wrapper for my jerky. Vanished. At some point, I swear it even pawed through my first aid kit, scattering bandages like confetti. The tent, my tent, had turned into a squirrel's studio apartment. Frustrated, I stepped outside to think. The forest was calm, crickets chirping, an owl calling in the distance, the fire glowing faintly in the embers. Out here, the world made sense. Inside, though, chaos. That was when it hit me. Maybe fighting the squirrel wasn't the answer. Maybe I had to coexist. So I did the only thing I could think of. I gathered what was left of my trail mix, broke it into a neat little pile, just outside the tent, and waited. I sat there by the fire, half asleep, watching the shadows flicker. Sure enough, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft thump inside. Then the shuffle of tiny paws. And finally, the triumphant moment. The squirrel zipped out of the flap, grabbed a nut, and scurried off into the night. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking I'd won at last. But when I peeked back inside, I realized it hadn't truly left. It had just taken the snack and stashed itself somewhere in the folds of my sleeping bag, ready for round 2. That's when I muttered out loud, "Well, I guess we're roommates now." And from the shadows of the tent, I swear I heard a squeak that sounded suspiciously like agreement. By dawn, I was a wreck. My roommate had spent the whole night treating my tent like a furnished loft. Every so often, I'd wake to the sound of scurrying across my chest or feel the faint tickle of whiskers near my ear. At one point, I sat up to see it perched boldly on my boot, grooming itself as if I were the intruder disturbing its peace. When the gray light finally crept through the trees, I rolled out of the tent with bags under my eyes and a strong craving for coffee I didn't have. The squirrel, meanwhile, seemed fresh as a daisy. It peeked out of the tent flap, blinking at the sunrise, then hopped right back inside like it had signed a year-long lease. I knew I couldn't let this continue. If I let it stay, by lunchtime I'd have no socks, no food, and probably no tent left. So I tried a different tactic. I packed up around it. I rolled my sleeping bag with dramatic thumps, stomped around loudly, and folded the tent stakes with enough clatter to scare off a deer. Slowly but surely, the squirrel grew restless. Finally, when I started collapsing the tent poles, the whole thing sagged, and out it came like a disgruntled tenant, evicted by force. It chattered furiously at me from the safety of a low branch, tail lashing like it was calling me every name under the sun. I laughed. What else could I do? My socks were chewed, my breakfast was gone, and my backpack looked like it had survived a minor explosion. But as I hoisted the pack and started down the trail, I found myself glancing back at that branch. The squirrel was still there, glaring like a scorned landlord, and for a moment I almost expected it to follow me. By the time I reached the ridge, though, the forest swallowed the campsite, and my brief cohabitation came to an end. I'll tell you this. I've faced storms, bears, and long nights in the wild, but nothing has made me feel more outmatched than that pint-sized squatter with a taste for trail mix. And the lesson. Out here, you can plan for weather, pack smart, and prepare for danger. But sometimes it's the smallest, sneakiest things that change the course of your night. Next time I camp, I'll double-check my pack, because you never know when you might be getting a new roommate.